I think this approach deserves to be called Christian for this reason, that the doctrine of the incarnation is the only thing that makes the belief in a transcendent creator one that we can actually discuss or speak about.
Hmm.
How do our terms apply to God? All our terms are drawn from creatures, from creation. If we call God Father, call God the Judge. God says in Scripture, don't get thinking that the things you use now you own permanently or have some absolute right to. The world's mine, not yours. Okay? We can go on and on and on. How can our terms apply to one who transcends all that, who called all that into existence? How can that be true of him? And the incarnation, that doctrine rejected by both Jew and Muslim, is the only answer that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Is that God takes created things into himself. That's what he did in the incarnation. He took the whole person of Jesus Christ into himself so that Christ is the human side of God and God is the divine side of Christ. That very idea of taking things that God himself has generated that depend on him into himself so that they are true of himself is how all the other terms got to be true of God as well.
Hmm.
They walked and talked with Adam. He said, "Don't do this." He said, "I got angry with this, and you're out of the garden for that." All that can be absolutely true because God takes the created characteristics he has generated into himself and forms the nature in, this is what Calvin said, the nature in which he is pleased to manifest himself. Now, the whole tradition of theology, from Augustine through Anselm and refined in Aquinas, denies that and instead identifies God with all and only Plato's perfections.
Hmm.
God is the being with all and only perfections.
Yeah.
Of course, he has perfect existence also. So he's self-existent, doesn't depend on anything. But what's the very nature of God is something he can't help. He doesn't have those perfections. He is them. God is the unity of all the perfections. And that theology dominates not only Catholic tradition in theology, but Protestantism as a movement has never left it. As a movement, Protestantism never followed Luther and Calvin on their doctrine of God. Reform the church, get rid of the Pope's authority. Yay, yay, yes, we'll follow that. Good stuff. But the doctrine of God, nah. Aquinas and Augustine got that right. And I think that the day that Augustine did that, it's in, I think it's book 3 of the City of God, the Platonists got it right. They saw that there were perfections and that there's a chief perfection Plato calls the Godfather of all things.
Hmm.
See, their mistake was in thinking that there are multiple, or maybe an infinite number, of perfections and the supreme one. We know that that's all in one being, the God of the Bible. Now, where does Scripture say God has all and only perfections? Where does it even say God has a perfection?
Yeah,
Nowhere.
no, that language is definitely alien from Scripture.
See, I love the way St. Basil, now the Eastern Church never bought this. They
Hmm.
rejected it before Augustine wrote it. And St. Basil said in one place, if there are perfections, God created them.
Hmm.
They
That's
don't
quite interesting.
constitute God. They're creations. I think, by the way, that there are no such things, and I offer an argument for that at the end of this book. There are no such things as perfections, as Plato defined them. So it's not demeaning to say of God that he doesn't have them. The only time the word perfect occurs in the New Testament that I know of is where Jesus says to his disciples, "You be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Now, if that meant Platonic perfections,
Yeah.
he'd be telling them to be God.
Yeah.
Wouldn't make any sense at all.
So your assertion is that Calvin gets this right, the
Yeah,
East gets this right,
Yeah.
but Augustine and Anselm and many who then many others got it wrong. So my question would be, where did Calvin get it from? Why did Calvin get this right? Especially because he follows Augustine so closely on so
Yeah.
many other things.
Okay. Um, both Luther and Calvin quote Augustine a lot to
Right.
support points. There's a reason for that. The Middle Ages was a time when quoting an ancient source settled a debate.
Right.
If you could find any ancient thinker that says what you're saying, you must be right. And Augustine became that kind of an authority in the Christian tradition. I think the guy made mistakes that are important, and but his authority has been so great, no one's or few people are willing to consider that he got something wrong. But Luther and Calvin found that he backed a lot of what they wanted to call for, so they quoted him often. Now, where did Calvin get this idea that agrees with the Eastern Orthodox? By the way, I'm going to add, the Eastern Orthodox recognize this about Calvin. There have been articles published about how Calvin's theology of God is the same as the Orthodox and blah, blah. And one of the great patriarchs of Constantinople, a man named Cyril Lucaris, made a trip to Geneva just to honor the memory of Calvin. That's sometime in the early 1700s, I think he made that trip. And Lucaris' will reads, if I die, and he was being threatened, and he ultimately was assassinated. If I die a Catholic of the Orthodox faith and an admirer of the esteemed John Calvin of Geneva. You know, you can't imagine two traditions more unalike when it comes to the organization of the church and the liturgy and all the rest of that. Orthodoxy has the most elaborate liturgy in Christendom, and Calvin had the minimum, the bare minimum. But when it came to the doctrine of God, the Orthodox have always recognized that this is so. And you said, where did Calvin get this? And I tried to find out if he read it in any of the Cappadocian fathers. This is Basil of Caesarea, Bishop of Caesarea, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, his brother-in-law, and his sister Macrina. They did a body of work that became the basis for Eastern Orthodox theology, the way Augustine did for the Western Church. Augustine wasn't the first to suggest that God is identical with Plato's forms. Who's the guy who came before him that was ruled a heretic? I was just going to say his name. That's one of the problems with being, we'll just say, over 75. We're just playing it down.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because
not the first to do this.
CW was like, you got to talk to Roy because and then the way CW described you, I'm thinking, oh, this poor guy, he's just barely hanging on. And I see you in CW, I see you in Christian's channel. It's like, this guy's just fine.
Well, can he tell you how old I am? My literary advisor told me not to let anybody know.
Don't worry about it. I think it's a milestone. It's fine to brag about it if you want to.
No,
but so where do you get this in Calvin?
I tried to find this out. So one of the things I did was go to the Princeton Seminary Library, and I got out a 4-volume work of Calvin's correspondence. Did he ever write a letter to any bishop east of Czechoslovakia? And I read all 4 volumes and never found it. There's no letter. I didn't find it. As far as I have been able to find, there was no contact between him and any bishop in the East. We know he did read some of the Cappadocians because he quotes them and refers to them. That's fine. But whether he got that doctrine of God from them or came on his own, I don't know. But he certainly held the same doctrine. That's very clear, and they admit it too. And they're pretty insular in that way. In the late 1500s, a delegation of Lutherans went to Constantinople and said they recognized this, and they said, don't we have the same theology? They were hoping to get some backing against the Pope. The patriarch took quite a while to answer them, but after a couple of years, he said, "Yes, we are, and you're welcome to rejoin the one true church anytime you want." But that was as far as that got. But again, they recognized that was Luther's doctrine too. So Protestantism kissed off the Reformers' doctrine of God.
Where would you point to in Calvin to articulate this point that you're making? Is it in his Institutes? Would it be
Oh,
in?
yes, sure, sure. Um, he says of the terms we use of God, none of this describes God per se, but rather how God relates to us. And that's just what the Orthodox view is.
Hmm,
They call God's manifestations and his relations to us his energies,
right.
because Paul uses that term, the energy of God, and so on. And Luther and Calvin often translate that works, God's works. It is in God's works that we see his nature manifest, says Calvin. So the point is that God establishes relations with humans that are created by him. They're not his uncreated originating being. They're a relation, a real relation with people, and they have created characteristics, mercifulness, judgment, approval, disapproval, encouragement, whatever. They have characteristics that are created that are subject to the laws of creation, the laws of logic. That's why we can form concepts of these relations and so on, and draw inferences and so on. Well, that's fine, but Calvin goes on to say, it's in the opening of the last book of the Institutes, he speaks of the nature in which God is pleased to manifest himself. You see, that's God's own choice. It's not a nature he can't help but have. That's what Aquinas says.
Hmm.
And do you know that this in two places Aquinas sees what else must be true if what he's saying of God is true? If God has only perfection, all the perfections and only perfections, then these are his own words. While creatures may have real relations to God, God has no real relations to creatures.
Wow.
See, relating to you and me isn't a perfection. He says God has no relation to creatures, but a logical one. That is, he's logically distinct
Hmm,
creatures. And he regards the laws of logic and of mathematics as uncreated. They are perfections in God.
hmm. So in some ways, then you wind up with a God who again is sort of an unmoved mover, someone
Not only
who
that,
cannot relate to us. And of course, Calvin will talk again and again about God condescending to us.
that's right. That's right. Comes to us as something we can know, but it's not a mask or something false, or think of me this way, although I'm not. I'm saying God took those characteristics into himself just as he took into himself the whole person of Christ. They're really true of him. They constitute his only nature. It's not a mask and there's something, another nature hidden behind it. The originating, the self-existent, originating being of God is totally inconceivable by us.
Well, on the basis of this conversation, I know a particular Unitarian that will be asking CW for your email address. So be prepared for that conversation. He actually works for Google. He's a very smart guy. He's one of these biblical Unitarians that feels very he's very much a part of our little corner of the internet, but he feels very all alone as a Unitarian. And I would imagine that there's something implicit in that name,
In fact, I've
Unitarian, where you
spoken
would
with a
feel
great many
lonely.
Unitarian churches, fellowships,
Yeah.
and known a lot of a number of the people, and
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed that contact.
He might be finding you.